What makes discovering a bonfire in Dark Souls feel so relieving? What makes the distant roar of a Reaper Leviathan so spine-tinglingly terrifying? And what makes Resident Evil's dumb, bullet-spongy zombies so thrilling to fight? The answer, wait for it, is tension. From classic titles to brand new blockbusters and across a variety of genres, tension is the secret ingredient that can turn otherwise simplistic battles into nail-biting duels and boring, time-consuming systems into gripping struggles. If you take the element of stress, anticipation, and excitement from a whole host of games, they literally cease to function, or at the very least, wouldn't work anywhere near as well. I first realised this after beating Resident Evil 8. One of the tensest games I've played in recent memory, and unlocking the Mercenaries mode, which is essentially a series of short mini-gauntlets through areas you've already played through in the main game, which I'll do my best to not spoil, by the way. What I was surprised to find is that with a few small changes, the Mercenaries mode managed to feel completely different from the rest of the game. You're fighting the exact same enemies, in exactly the same spooky locations, using the exact same guns and controls, but now you have a virtually inexhaustible supply of ammo, and all the zombies have health bars. In essence, you have much more freedom and have access to much more information in this side mode than the main game ever gives you. And as a result, in spite of its much more exhilarating pace and higher difficulty, I found the Mercenaries mode kinda boring. It's not a bad little extra, but what Mercenaries mode made me realise is that the artful use of tension, apprehension, and excitement is much more powerful than we give it credit for, and many games owe their appeal not to how smooth they control or how deep their systems are, but how well they can manipulate their audience into getting nice and tense. So, how do games create a feeling of tension? Well, I think that, fundamentally, the core of tension lies in the loss of control. Whether we're talking about excitement or fear, it's not really possible to create these emotions if the player isn't kept on the back foot to some degree. In Alien Isolation, for example, the fact that you can't kill the alien no matter how hard you try, and the fact that your scanner is awful and barely works, are key to the sense of danger that the game creates. You play by the alien's rules, not your own, meaning that the game can constantly keep you unsettled and afraid simply by putting you in the same environment as Mr. Biteyface. In the same vein, finding a bonfire in a Souls-like is so relieving because it means that you can finally stop worrying about the threat of losing all your progress or running out of healing items, giving you a well-earned brief moment where you can relax and recuperate in your own time. This loss of control leading to tension can manifest in a variety of ways, but I think you can sum up the two main approaches like this. Tension arises when we lose personal agency, but also when we lack information. One of the most simplistic ways of generating tension by taking control away from the player's autonomy is the classic ticking timer. The knowledge that your plans and actions are ultimately subject to a constantly decreasing time limit instantly raises the stakes and can encourage players to act recklessly, particularly when the time limit is always visible. This can create much more interesting gameplay. Like in Pikmin, which uses its 30-day time limit and its limited day cycles to push you into tackling battles and puzzles you're not completely comfortable with, all in the name of efficiency. Another way to create a similar effect is to require players to manage their resources. In Unrailed, a great team-based construction game, you're constantly worrying about not just the train crashing, but also topping up your water levels, harvesting enough construction materials to build new tracks, and finding hidden upgrade currency, forcing even coordinated teams to make interesting sacrifices and panicked last-second changes of plan just to keep on pace. It's worth noting that logistics games such as Satisfactory often have plentiful or near infinite resources, and that's why they feel so chill. However, that's not to say that the only way to create a tension of action is to have some sort of resource that's running out. In Half-Life Alyx's best level, named after its resident bad guy Jeff, you're pitted against an unkillable zombie with very good hearing, meaning you have to drastically change the way you play to avoid Jeff hearing you and beating you to a pulp. Jeff will charge towards almost any sound he hears, and this means that you've got to be incredibly careful walking around searching for loot, because more often than not, there'll be precariously placed glass bottles inside of cabinets or balanced on top of boxes just waiting to smash loudly on the ground. Not only that, but the distillery where Jeff lives is filled with these bastards, which spew out choking spores, meaning you've got to cover your mouth with one hand for large stretches of time to avoid Alyx coughing and giving a position away. This has the knock-on effect of leaving you with only one free hand, forcing you to choose between the safety of carrying a gun or an item that will let you distract Jeff and being able to manipulate the environment or solve puzzles. Just by restricting what you can do, Both in a physical sense, and in the sense that Jeff can't be killed by ordinary means, Half-Life Alyx turns some very fun and expressive physics systems into some blood-curdlingly tense interactions, with one particularly memorable encounter with a very clumsy headcrab bringing me out in cold sweats whenever I think about it. It is incredibly tense, and I loved it. Of course, restricting a player's action and autonomy is only one way that games can make us feel tense. Taking away a player's control over how much they know works just as well, if not better. Hell, the reason why darkness is such a primal fear and why we instantly get on edge at night is because it greatly restricts the sense most of us rely on most: our sight. When we have to guess and infer as to what's going on, the emotional, irrational side of our brain takes over, creating epic struggles and clutch victories that would be impossible to create if our brains actually had all the facts. In Monster Hunter, for example, players have access to a ridiculous amount of information. I mean, just look at the game's traditionally incomprehensible UI, but one very important number they can't get access to is how much health monsters have. In fact, the only way to tell how hurt a monster is to watch its animations change and notice it getting progressively more battle scarred. The fact that you have to get to know how various monsters behave when they're winning or when they're wounded injects them with an incredible amount of personality and makes those last-ditch death matches in the monster's lair, where both of you are on your last legs, brilliantly tense and incredibly rewarding because you know the next hit could be the killing blow, but there's no way to be sure. Something that would be impossible to convey if the monster had a visible health bar. And in Hellblade's Senua's Sacrifice, a major mechanic is the rot, which grows slightly further along Senua's body whenever you die, and if it reaches her head, she's dead for good. It's impossible to tell exactly how close Senua is to succumbing to the rot, meaning the further you progress through the game, and the more you die to the game's punishing combat, the game creates this great rising sense of dread as you approach its final levels, battling not just against the enemies, but against yourself, as you're forced to confront the fact that you have an unknown number of resets, with each death bringing you closer and closer to the end. If the game revealed the truth of how the rot's mechanics work, the tension it creates would evaporate, and you'd end up playing in a less interesting way that no longer reflects the fear and anxiety of the core of Senua's psychosis, which, if you're looking for a name for the sequel, give me a call. However, creating a sense of tension is the easy part. Properly maintaining it across an entire level, area, or even a whole game is much, much harder. Because tension is such a powerful emotion, it can be incredibly exhausting, and games that refuse to let up will often find their audience giving up after just a couple of hours. Many survival games, for example, are so punishing and require you to constantly manage so many bars, timers, and resources that they can become overwhelming. I've tried several times to play The Long Dark, but the sheer relentlessness of its systems and the constant fear of starving, freezing, or getting eaten by a bear means I get burnt out very quickly. Similarly, in a lot of horror games, like the original Dead Space, there's so much spooky music and so many broken lights and body horror beasties that eventually these concepts become normalized, and so you no longer feel out of your element and disempowered. The build up to your first encounter with a slasher is an incredibly tense experience, but by the time you've learned how to kill them and figured out how Dead Space works, those very same jump scares just become annoying, and the enemies themselves, well, they may as well be Goombas. As paradoxical as it might sound, tension as a thematic device is much more powerful when it isn't omnipresent. By knowing when to ease off and when to really push players, games can keep the level of pressure constantly changing so that it's both impossible to get used to, but also much harder for players to get burned out. Which, predictably, brings me back to the undisputed queen of spine-tinglingly tense video games.
Resident Evil.
Yeah, that one. The fantastic thing about the Resi games is that they're usually not particularly scary, with only 1 or 2 genuine horror moments per game. However, what they are is extremely good at keeping players on edge and unnerved throughout the entire experience, and they do this by constantly varying how much tension the player is under at any given time. In Resident Evil, regular enemies usually aren't much of a threat, but without exception, they take a lot of bullets to put down, with single basic zombies in Resident Evil 8 requiring almost a whole pistol clip's worth of body shots to kill. Not only does this force players to constantly confront the unknown variable of just how many enemies there are between them and their destination, but also to grow steadily more paranoid about how best to use their dwindling resources. This pushes players into developing interesting strategies to deal with zombies more effectively, offering a brief respite and a small feeling of empowerment whenever they pull them off, helping to break up each fight. However, this doesn't last for long, as each of these strategies also open up new sources of tension for players to contend with. Headshotting zombies or going for close range shotgun blasts does a lot more damage, and is thus more efficient, but lining up a clean shot takes precious time, and you run the risk of missing entirely if one of the bastards dodges to the side at the last moment. Avoiding or just stunning zombies is another way to save on ammo, and it feels great to give them the runaround, but it adds an additional bit of unknown information to the mix as you have to worry about potentially crossing paths with a half-dead and pissed off zombie on your next trip through the area. Equally, the knife is a weapon with technically near infinite efficiency, needing no ammo, but it requires some nerves of steel to use effectively, and will mean you'll take a lot more incidental damage, putting pressure on your supply of healing items. It's also worth noting that Resident Evil never tells you quite how much health you actually have, instead splitting things into fine, caution, and danger. This means that using healing items usually has a measurable impact, but you're also encouraged to use them efficiently by getting into the danger zone, which leads to much more fun and risky gameplay. In short, Resident Evil's resource management is genius because even if you're playing efficiently, the best strategies still introduce new unknown variables or disempower you in some crucial way, rather than making you safer. This feedback loop means that the game can still build tension at a steady rate regardless of a player's skill level. It's not just the resource management that contributes to Resident Evil's rising tension. Unkillable pursuer type enemies, like Lady D or Mr. X, who chase you around and ensure you constantly have to be on the move, are so scary and are such an effective source of tension because they're not always right behind you. The game carefully paths pursuers around such that they'll chase you for a little bit and then wander off, before ambushing you somewhere else. This means that they're always in your mind as both an unknown bit of information and something that can control where you go, while still letting you play the game normally when they're not around. This cycle of tension, then relief, then a raising of the stakes, also exists at a much larger scale, repeating several times as you progress through any given area. In Castle Dimitrescu, for example, you'll start with no enemies to face at all, then you've got to deal with these zombies, then the daughters get thrown into the mix, then the big titty vampire MILF starts chasing you around as well, and at the last moment you even get a new type of zombie to deal with, these arseholes with bat wings, before building to a boss fight to cap things off. In between each of these escalations, the game always makes sure to loop you back around to the Duke's shop, which is a completely safe area, allowing you to replenish your supplies, save the game, and mentally prepare yourself before continuing. Even in sections with minimal combat, Resident Evil games always follow this structure, slowly upping the tension by adding in some jump scares, turning off the lights, or introducing a new friend for you to play with before bringing you back to somewhere relatively safe for you to catch your breath before sending you out again. In addition, in Resident Evil 4 and 8, the inclusion of money as a resource can strengthen this tension boosting cycle. See, in the games without item shops, dead enemies will just drop items which you'll need to scavenge to keep yourself topped up, but in the ones with merchants, enemies will often drop money and treasure instead. The key difference with cash is that whilst it does directly translate into supplies and upgrades, it's useless until you get it to a shop. This means that the player's resources will drain much quicker, pushing them into that great tense place where they've got to make interesting tough decisions much more quickly, but counterbalancing it with a great rush of power and relief when they get to spend all that money in one go the next time the game leads them around to a shop. This brings me on to the final important way that games can handle tension, and it's actually something that Resident Evil is historically pretty bad at, namely, resolving the tension. Altering the level of tension a player is under is a great way to make that feeling last longer, but eventually, the game needs to release that built up energy and bring things to an enjoyable climax. Otherwise, you'll be left with a masturbation joke that doesn't really go anywhere and fails to truly satisfy. The resolution of tension is something that usually happens at the end of a game, but not always. It can happen any time a player goes from a state of disempowerment, which is where tension comes from, to being in control. Because Resident Evil draws most of its tension from the slow threat of losing your resources, when it finally pits you against a big boss monster and chucks a bunch of ammo and health packs at you, it's hard to reconcile the cautious, economic way you've been conditioned to play the rest of the game with the bombastic, cinematic vibe of the boss fights. While the climaxes of Resi games do have their moments, like letting you finally get revenge on and kill Mr. X with a rocket launcher at the end of Resident Evil 2, they usually end up feeling out of place and confusing, compromising future sources of tension because they make you feel too powerful and too in control. The way to compellingly resolve all that tension a game is building up isn't necessarily to make the player feel as powerful as possible, but instead to allow them to regain the control they've lost or acquire knowledge that has been denied to them. Often, this can be as simple as killing a big boss monster that's been making your life miserable, but surprisingly, it's the less immediate sources of tension that can feel the most satisfying for players to eliminate. For example, Subnautica, as well as its sequel, are great at ratcheting up the tension, with the threat of running out of vitals or oxygen acting as an action tension, and the psychological terror that comes from the game's leviathans giving away just enough information to let you know they're there, hunting you, but never quite enough to know where they are until it's too late, acting as an informational tension. These tensions are resolved bit by bit the more you play, and the three main phases of the game are marked by your ability to explore and protect yourself drastically increasing. For example, the Sea Moth and Sea Truck make staying underwater for extended periods of time much easier, as they serve as a portable air supply, essentially removing a big source of early game stress. The Prawn Suit too, acquired later in each game, allows you to fend off or at least survive against hostile creatures, putting you another important step towards mastering the underwater world. The transition from feeling very vulnerable for the first few hours of the game to feeling virtually indestructible once you get your hands on the Prawn Suit is a great moment, and a highlight of every playthrough. Similarly, games focused around exploration can resolve the tension that comes from being lost and confused in very satisfying ways if they time it right. Super Metroid very famously spends its first half constantly blocking the player off and trapping them in various areas, selling the feeling of a harsh alien world that you can't predict. So when you finally make your way back to the surface and for the first time truly understand the geography of Zebes, you go from timid explorer to badass space hero, ready to finish the job. And the thrill of opening up a treasure chest in The Legend of Zelda feels so damn rewarding because the game has been constantly building up that anticipation and sense of relief by blocking off your path and teasing you with all the potential applications of the item you're about to collect. That great fanfare when you finally kick the thing open is symbolic of the game handing over the impetus to you and letting you explore the rest of the dungeon to your heart's content. Tension is a weird thing. It's an invisible force that does nothing on its own, but serves to accentuate and amplify an entire spectrum of emotions. Whether it's the giddy excitement of racing against the clock, or the butt-clenching fear of being hunted by a monster, tension only makes these experiences more intense. Sometimes we feel compelled to fight with games to maintain as much personal autonomy as we can and learn as much as we're able, but tension only works when we give that control away and let the game take over for a while. Whether you're exploring the deeps or running away from this jerk, you'll have a much more fun time if occasionally you just take a step back and engage with the game on its own terms. Now, if you don't mind, I've got some romantic tension to break with a certain very tall lady, so I'll see you around, okay? What do you mean she's only in the first quarter of the game? That's it, I'm getting a refund. Hello one and all, and welcome to the After the Video segment, which I will continue to call it, in spite of having several better names I could use. Here is where I give a shout out to my cool patrons, and point you in the direction of an internet person who's much more talented than I am. Or in this case, internet people. Because what I'd like to recommend is No More Jockeys, a YouTube channel / game show starring Alyx Horn, who you may recognise from the TV show Taskmaster, as well as fellow comedians Tim Key and Mark Watson, who you might also recognise from Taskmaster. The rules of No More Jockeys are too complicated to explain here, but it's essentially competitive trivia / debate, and it usually devolves into drunken arguments about whether birds are animals and whether Chairman Mao's first name was actually Chairman. It's a great spectator sport, and it's also a great game to play with your friends if they like arguing like mine do. Please do check it out. Speaking of great things, my patrons might be even cooler, because they fund the creation of these videos, and that is the kind of thing that only truly special people do. In return, they get early access to videos, cut talking points like me explaining why Resident Evil 8 loves abusing the player's hands, and some brilliant shoutouts from my top tier mysterious benefactors, who just so happen to be Alex Deloche, Alex Vieira, Andrew Lebrano, Asaran, Ashley Shade, Alsakav, Brennan Spalding, Brian Atariani, Konstantin Punkt, Cosmix360, Daniel Medjes, David Setzer, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Dontwo, DJ Daniel, Ekton, Edward Franklin Woods, Eugene Bulkin, Evie, Gazkul, Gretar Hannison, Jacob Dylan Riddle, James Andrew Adams, Joey Bruno, Jordan Gear, George Aria Navarro, Kai Gillespie, Lee Berman, Lucas Flack, Mace Window 54, Max Filipov, NWDD, Nate Graff, Patrick Romberg, Powell Yaroz, Philby the Bilby, Prospero, Reddit X, Regal Regex, Ray's Dad, Sheldon Hearn, Simon Jacobson, Steve Riley, Strateger in Ultima, The Forbidden Shrimp, Tyler Duncan, Zach Grendel, and Chow. Right, that is all of them. Thank you for watching. and I'll see you all around. Bye now!